I have a couple of topics. Let me. Oh gosh, I have a really weird setup here because my mic is a nice one. I
Yeah.
mean, it's the cheapest one from. If you want to go professional, this is the cheapest one.
Hmm.
But it doesn't have a good stand, so
Oh.
I'm using one of the toys of my daughter, and I'm putting it on top of it, and it's like taking the whole keyboard, so I'm not able to type or something. But anyways,
Nice.
hey everyone, this is my first episode in English, and my guest this time is my colleague Cole Peters. I usually ask my guests to tell something about themselves. Cole, can you say a couple of sentences about you?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I'm a designer slash developer from Canada. I've been in London, England for the past 4 years or so. Um, yeah, that was really bad. Can we start again?
Nah, it's completely normal. And all my guests, when I ask them this question, they say, "Oh gosh, what the hell? This is really difficult. I can't say just a couple of things about me." Anyways, it was completely fine. It was completely fine. But do remember that this is not live, so I could delete everything after that.
Excellent.
Yeah. If, like, for example, if you share some company secret or something, we could just like
Oh,
delete it.
sweet. I have
Yeah.
like 20 of those I need to share.
Okay. Awesome. Okay, so how did you start it with all this web stuff? Do you remember when was the first time when you actually like decided to make something for web?
Yeah, I do actually. I think it was back in somewhere around 2008 thereabouts. I'd been into graphic design for quite a while since I was in junior high. So since I was 12 or 13, and I started off just in PowerPoint and like making really bad 3D.
PowerPoint.
Yeah, and doing really bad like 3D graphics. Do you remember Bryce 3D by any chance?
What? No.
It
No.
was it was one of the first 3D modeling pieces of software that I got a hold of. On it was on an iMac in like 2002 or something. Anyways, it was just really bad 3D modeling, and I remember as part of this high school course, we had to put a bunch of our 3D models together in a PowerPoint presentation. And that was when I sort of first got into graphic design just through laying out PowerPoints, which was kind of like a boring start. But for doing web stuff, I was working as an advertising director in a photo retail company back in Canada, and most of the work I was doing had been in print, sort of scheduling or laying out advertising campaigns and brochures and flyers and print advertisements and that sort of thing. And I started getting more and more into web design just on the side as I was learning more and more about design just through this job. And yeah, I started reading. I think the first book I read was Jeremy Keith's HTML5 for Designers, I think it was called. It was one of the first books in the Book Apart series. And then I picked up, they had also had CSS3 for designers. I can't remember the author. So I just started tinkering around with that in my spare time. And a couple years later, I left that job to co-found a web design practice with a good friend of mine. And that was sort of the start for me.
Uh-huh. So it was like a small company, which.
Yeah, it was just the two of us. She had been freelancing for quite a while herself. I had been working sort of on the side and then doing more graphic design in my day-to-day job. We had actually started. We met working on a freelance project together for a sort of creative community meetup group back in Winnipeg. So we started doing this freelance website project together, and we realized that we really liked working together. So we decided to start this company and kind of go all out and see if we could make anything of it. So it was just the two of us, and yeah, sort of started out with some smaller projects, and we ended up doing one sort of larger project before I left Canada, which was kind of cool. But yeah, that was sort of the start of it, officially.
And then you make like billions, but you get bored and you kind of quit.
Yeah, I mean, once you make your first billion, it just kind of gets boring after that, right? So
Yeah, I know how
yeah,
it
no,
works. Yeah, I know how it works. Okay,
yeah, no,
so
we actually our first big project was for a not-for-profit organization, which was kind of weird because we pitched it to them as a pro bono project. Like we would do it for them, sort of for one, just for to do charitable work, but also to build up our portfolio. And then they ended up actually paying us for the work, and that ended up being sort of our first project that we actually could live off of for a little bit, which was kind of nice. Yeah.
so guys, Ko was the first designer which I know which was actually doing. So let me step back a little bit. So I made a presentation like maybe 3-4 years ago at a conference here in Varna about designing for web, and what I was advocating for was designing in the browser, because I think that this is like we're living in another medium right now, and if you're designing for if you're making designs that will probably live in the browser, you better start doing them there. And you are actually the first one which I saw doing this.
Wow, really?
Yeah, and till today, not many people are actually. If I have to name someone, I actually can't, because most of the people, they just still do design in another software, and then send the layouts and the wireframes to someone, and we have this process of splicing and everything. But you are doing this in the browser, and I was really surprised that someone is actually doing it. Because I was thinking this must be the right approach, and I tried once, and I know that it's quite challenging. Do you isn't it like limiting your creativity there? Because I remember when I have something I have similar background as you, because I started as a graphic designer and I was doing only print work, and then I had to start making websites, and I kind of doing them in the same way, like doing the layout, moving blocks in Photoshop, and I know that in the browser you can just like drag something and you see it on the right side and everything. So don't you think that the browser is actually limiting your designer creativity in some way?
I don't think I've ever found that. I mean, when I first started getting into designing with code, I mean, I for sure wasn't among the earliest people to do it. I mean, no question. And I feel like it was a lot simpler when I started out. I mean, when I started learning coding for the web, it was, if you knew HTML and CSS and a little bit of jQuery, you could pretty much consider yourself a solid front-end developer as well as a designer. And so I think it was fairly straightforward to pick up, and so I didn't find a lot of hurdles to implementing the designs that I wanted to build, and so I never found it really was limiting my creativity that much. And in fact, the more I became familiar with coding, the less conversations I had to have with developers where I would design something, they would say, well, there's no way you can build that, or if I build this, it's not going to work very well, or it's going to be really slow for the user, or something like that. So yeah, I mean, I didn't find it very limiting at all. If anything, I found it more. I mean, I felt more capable as a designer because I knew how to create designs that were tailored for the context of the web.
Oh, you made a really good point that actually this there are like maybe thousands of articles on this topic. The war between designers and developers, and like many talks, they're giving some advices how to actually eliminate these issues between designers and developers. But I think that maybe the shortest way is just to warn the designers to kind of slice their designs and actually produce HTML and CSS at the end, because it's then they feel the pain. But yeah, I guess it's just like solving some issues.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like even if I don't think it's a requirement for designers to know how to code.
Oh,
but
yeah,
I think
it's not.
But I think if you have at least if you have an understanding of how it works on a basic level, and you understand a little bit about just the way the web works in general from a front-end perspective, you're able to work a lot more efficiently. And I think you're able to deliver better designs because you're going to be working with the preconceptions that a web user will have, right? You're not going to necessarily try and break things to break patterns that users expect without knowing that you're breaking them.
Oh yeah, I remember when I was working at this agency before joining Trowridge, we because I think I worked there 2 years, and in the beginning I joined as a Flash developer, and I remember how the designer was actually working in a different way if the design will be made in Flash and if the design is made just for the browser. Because in Flash you could actually recreate whatever UI you want because you are coding everything. Like they made like really fancy drop downs, which are like, this is not the native drop down of the browser, for example. But yeah, I remember how the designs which were for a browser, they look quite simple. Not so. You remember this Aqua style where?
Oh yeah,
there were like reflections everywhere, drop shadows and stuff.
Yeah, that was like when macOS 10, like the very first macOS X dropped, right? And everything was Aqua. Like the iMac was Aqua and blue and bubbly, and all of the UI was, super reflective and everything. That brings up memories of working with Flash too, because I remember, like before I got into any sort of professional design, I used to make websites for myself in Flash just for fun. And I remember how cool I thought it was, because like way back when I was, like middle teenager, I would mess around with Dreamweaver and try and make websites.
Oh, yeah,
I wouldn't really I wouldn't code anything. I would look at the code and be like, I don't know what this is, but I would make websites in Dreamweaver. And then when I got my hands on Flash, it was like, oh my God, I can do anything now.
Yeah, I think the best part in Flash development was when you actually realize that all the stuff that you are able to do, like with the UI of the Flash software, like using their instruments to move elements and stuff. I remember that the most amazing moment was when I realized that all this stuff are actually I could program everything. I could move elements with code. I could make animations with code. And then I was really into Flash, and that's why I was actually a Flash developer for, I don't know, 3-4 years or something. And then someone published this letter saying, nah, we're not supporting Flash on my web devices. So sorry. And then everything went to the JavaScript world. But the really nice thing was that all these years where I was learning ActionScript, because Flash, the code, the language of all the Flash applications was actually ActionScript. And ActionScript 3, by the way, is really close to JavaScript because it's ECMAScript based.
I keep hearing this, yeah.
Yeah, and it was really nice because I was like just jumping to JavaScript, and I was really smooth transition between the two, and it was
That's
quite
cool.
nice. Yeah, it was
Nice.
quite nice.
How many times a day did you used to visit the Too Advanced website?
Oh gosh. I'm still doing it, by the way, from time to
Oh
time,
yeah.
and
Yeah, I go back to it like at least once a year just to revisit
yeah,
how
yeah,
crazy it was.
Eric Jordan and company, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Um, yeah, this was the yeah,
I
this was
feel like
the
that
king.
I feel like that must have been for designers and developers one of the coolest times on the web, and for web users it must have been one of the worst. Because like everything took so long to load and it was complex. You couldn't like guess at any patterns and you kind of just had to like wade through it. Oh.
Yeah,
But at the
but
same time it was so cool to build that stuff if you weren't actually trying to do anything for, a user.
it was really cool. I remember when I was in high school, my dream was to join a company here in Bulgaria, and their website was really close to what Too Advanced did.
Mm.
Like really, it was built in Flash and all these 3D effects and animations and the reflections everywhere and these cool animations. And I was thinking, oh gosh, these are the Bulgarian Too Advanced. I should join them. Uh, yeah, it was quite nice. By the way, Too Advanced are still a company. They're still building stuff.
No way.
Yeah, they're still building stuff, and they're making responsive websites and stuff.
Wow.
Yeah, I'm following Eric somewhere. I think it's Twitter. I don't know, or maybe Facebook. He was doing some music stuff, by the way, like
Okay.
some trance or something like this. I don't know.
Yeah.
Um,
Wow.
yeah, what
Crazy days.
crazy days. Yeah, indeed. So, when we were talking about design in the browser, what's your opinion about design systems? My last guess, we kind of talked a little bit about design systems, and just to clarify what I understand in the term design systems is when you are actually designing a product, but not designing pages and just like different components, like parts of the pages split by functionality, for example. So, I so together with designing in the browser, I think that this is the ultimate designing workflow where you design for the browser, but you design only the different bits of the applications, like split in modules, for example. Yeah, what do you think about this approach?
Yeah, it's. I think I've been a little bit out of the game, so to speak, in terms of what's been happening with design systems for the past couple of years, just because I've been so engrossed in the work that we've been doing, where we work. But I mean, I think it's obviously the place that everyone seems to be going. I mean, there are businesses being built now that are strictly around providing tooling for design systems. So obviously, it's caught on in a big way, and I mean, I think it's definitely. I mean, it definitely has a really positive impact, I think, because as soon as you make that switch from doing one-off work where every page is unique and for some reason it has different styles and, it's just so much more efficient for designers and developers, and you end up delivering so much more consistency to end users, which is obviously also a benefit. I mean, I think it's definitely the way to go for the way that the web is working right now.
Yeah, okay, I agree. I have two arguments against this approach, and
Mm-hmm.
not like I don't like it, but I'm always trying to see like the other side of the coin.
Yeah.
Why we can't actually apply this approach? And the first one is, I think, because the context is king. I think that in the small companies where like the agencies, for example, where they have short deadlines, this may not work really well, because if you have to build like a promotion website with just a single page, for example, or just a couple, maybe 2-3 pages, maybe this doesn't make sense. So this is my first argument. And the other one is that sometimes you need really experienced designer to do this, because I guess it's difficult to see how the whole page looks like, combining all this stuff, and kind of designing them in isolation maybe is a little bit too challenging.
Yeah, I think it does demand a little bit of experience in terms of thinking of design from a more architectural standpoint. Because certainly, I mean, with traditional... No, that's not even true. I was going to say with traditional graphic design, you wouldn't have so many systems baked in, but that's completely inaccurate. I mean, you look at the grid work that Joseph Mueller-Brockmann was doing in the 60s, that was all about systems, so I totally take that back. But I think probably the naive approach to design is always to make it just look good, as opposed to thinking about it as, a quote-unquote living system. And it is hard to jump from basically just styling the content that you have in front of you to thinking about it in a more systematic way. And I think you're right. There is certainly a demand of time that's made with these sort of systems that may not work in certain contexts. I mean, in the case that you gave of agencies, you're always going to have crazy fast deadlines, and obviously every client has completely different branding guidelines, if they have them at all. So I don't know. I mean, I think I've seen more and more sort of skeleton design systems popping up, and this isn't necessarily anything new, but even if you look at something like Bootstrap, right? They have a common system of components that you can easily reskin to make it look appropriate for another client, but the idea of a design system is sort of baked in there. And I think more and more we're going to see that that sort of architectural approach being championed, maybe in a way where the visuals aren't necessarily baked right in, and that's left up to the design team. But maybe there is, maybe there are going to be more frameworks out there that allow you to work in a more systematic way without having to, without having to make it from scratch every time. Because that's definitely a big draw for sure. You need people who are able to think about it in the right way, and certainly if you're making one from scratch, you need the time to actually think about it in a very sort of broad spectrum.
Yeah, you said something. Just make it look good, right?
Yeah.
It's quite funny how good actually changed over the years, because like I remember when I started, was this Aqua Age, where like reflections and drop shadows and all this stuff, they were really cool, and people like, wow, this looks really nice. And then we see this flat design, and then like everything went to just lots of white spaces in the websites and really minimalistic look with everything, and which leads to a conclusion which I made years ago about the design, that the design is super subjective thing. I mean, something looks even at home when I when I pick the quotes for my daughter every morning, and I'm thinking that, oh, this looks really nice, so I combine like two things, and my wife was like, what, you are a designer, this is really terrible color decision. Something like that. What the hell are you doing? We can't pick these colors really. And I was thinking, what, this was working in the web, it was really nice combining these two colors, it was nice. And so yeah, the design is I guess something different for different people. And
oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I guess there's a certain, I always see it as there's a level of design that is, well, design as a whole is certainly very objective, like so many other things, but certainly that top layer of it that you might refer to as the aesthetics of it. Yeah, I mean, just Google the term bike shedding, right? And yeah, it's tough to get around that when you're a designer, because it's that surface layer that anyone can easily have an opinion on without necessarily having to be educated in it.
I by the way had a point in my life where I had to pick. I guess it happened not really like from one day ago, and it was more like a decision which I made at some point that I'm not actually doing design anymore. I decided to kind of because when I was freelancing, I was doing the whole thing. I was doing like the design, then I slice it, then I move on with the backend and stuff. But at some point, I decided, oh god, this design process is really terrible because they want me to change stuff with like 2 pixels left or something, and it's really with programming is it works or it doesn't. Like you click here, nothing happens. Okay, it's broken. When with design, I know that this is the better color, for example, and they ask me, nah, we should use this other one, and yeah, I think that the programming in general is maybe not so. What's the word? I don't know. It's
not so much up for debate.
Yeah. I'm not saying that it's easier, but it's kind of maybe a matter of experience. While the design is more like just opinion of people, and they decide, oh, this looks better than this other design.
I used to think the same thing.
You used to think?
Yeah, I used to think the same thing before I started doing more serious, more in-depth front-end development.
Mm-hmm.
And then the more I started learning about front-end development, it occurred to me, at least in my experience, that there's just as much subjectivity about development. It just comes from different people. Because how many conversations have you had about tabs versus spaces, or
oh gosh,
code formatting?
No semicolons, Robbie. No semicolons.
Or whether you should use Angular or React or Vue or Preact or
I see.
What the hell else is going on? Yeah. I mean, it's not to say that all of those opinions won't necessarily be informed by something, but I think, at least in my limited experience, there's just as much bike shedding going on, but I think it happens with different contexts, and it comes from different people.
Oh, that's interesting.
I mean, certainly someone who has never heard of development before would have a hard time walking into a room and forming an opinion right off the bat. Whereas with design, I mean, we grow up as humans learning to interpret patterns and signals and all of this. And so it's sort of baked in that we have an opinion naturally about those sorts of things. But I think as far as the work goes, I've encountered just as much of that with design as I have with development.
Oh gosh. Now, tonight when I lay down, I'll just continue thinking about this. And probably I'll realize, oh gosh, I made the wrong decision like years ago. I had to stay in the design.
That's my favorite part about doing both, is that now I get to have conversations about both sides of this.
Yeah.
I think it should be in pink, and you should use semicolons.
Okay. So you mentioned Bootstrap. Let's talk a little bit about CSS.
Okay.
So I think the way of how we are doing the CSS is maybe not the best approach, but it works really well. I'll just share what we're doing, because probably now only me and you know how we actually do stuff. It's this approach where we create bunch of atomic CSS classes which are just targeting one thing, and we are combining them. I'm not talking about the implementation, like the fact that we're using CSS in JavaScript, but in general, we have a bunch of CSS classes which define only one style, and like for example, if you need to define the font size of 20 pixels and padding of 1 pixel, we have two different classes for this thing, and we're just applying these classes, and by combining different classes we achieve our goals. So I see that this approach has problems as well, because you have to create like a bunch of classes just about everything. But yeah, so how do you think about the other approach where it's more like framework-ish approach, where maybe you have like different layers in your application and you define container, child, and that's it, and you just put lots of styles in there?
Yeah, I think for the type of work that I'm doing and the experiences I've had, I understand where that approach to CSS came from, and I see why people like it, but I would never ever use it again if the work continues to be composed of the problems that it is right now for me. I find it often leads to very, very large style sheets, and you end up having quite a lot of lines of CSS that are effectively just overrides for very specific instances of elements or components. And of course, as you start to see your CSS size balloon, you increase loading time, and especially in a mobile context, loading time is, pretty much first concern, aside from the usefulness of the product, I think. I see where, and I used to use it all the time myself, and I would never go back to it unless something extraordinary happened that I needed to use it that I can't think of.
Then what are the downsides of this approach? The one that we are using.
Like the more atomic approach of it, or functional or whatever. Yeah. It's a very big shift in thinking for a lot of people who have become very comfortable in that sort of BEM style CSS. So certainly every time we've brought on a new front-end person where we're using it, it's always a little bit of a question mark for them, like, what? Why would you do that? And it takes a decent amount of time to sort of bring people up to speed with it and start thinking in that way. And so certainly, one potential downside is that if you're using it in production and you're bringing on new people, it's often a little bit of a learning shift. I think that's slowly starting to change, but it's a downside for right now, I guess. But I think it doesn't outweigh all the positives. What else? I can't think of anything else, to be honest. That's sort of it. There's a little bit of a learning curve.
Yeah, that's our baby. We can't just say that something is wrong, right?
I think, if there was something glaringly wrong with it, I'd be happy to talk about it. But right off the top of my head, that's all I can think of, to be honest. Every time I've used this approach, it's a way smaller file size. There's way less duplication of code. Once developers are familiar with it, it's super fast to work with. And especially when you're talking about designing in the browser, my experience has been that it's amazing for that sort of work, because you don't even have to go into your editor to change, classes or something like that. You can open up your app or your web page in your browser, pop open the dev tools, and just switch out your classes in the markup, and instantly you can be redesigning your page right there, which is so much more efficient when you have, say it's, to take an example that I've been in, me as a designer, or like as a UI designer with a UX designer and a product manager. It's so seamless to sit in front of a screen and just be changing out classes in your dev tools to see how a different design would look. It's pretty tough to beat that.
Yeah, I actually have the same experience when I had to, like, I received, for example, a layout which I have to implement now, and I remember when I had to do it in in the browser, I just like working at the wireframes, and I just start using classes and just add, remove, and
Yeah.
it works really, really well indeed.
That's actually one thing I miss about the way that we've been doing it recently with doing more CSS in JS. And I think I've definitely seen a couple tools that might work to bring that advantage back. But that's definitely one thing I miss about the way we're doing it now, is that you always have to go into your React components and switch out some of the styling internally and recompile it. But I mean, yeah, as a general approach, I think that's such a win for so many different contexts.
Yeah. Okay. You mentioned this very compiling step.
Yeah.
So I guess it's. Did you ever actually thinking about CSS in JavaScript in a negative way, like thinking, "Oh gosh, this is like really
Oh,
stupid."
totally. Oh, yeah, for sure. Before I actually used it.
So that was the kind of the point where you decided that it works when you start using it, or like.
Yeah, more or less. I mean, it was a gradual change of opinion, I think. Um, to be honest, I'm still a tiny bit split on it. I don't necessarily feel strongly one way or another about it. I think there's advantages and disadvantages to both. Um, but I can certainly see where a lot of the arguments against it come from, I think. There's, I mean, as if you're talking about designers implementing their work, there's obviously another level. I mean, there's a steeper learning curve to learning to work with CSS in JavaScript, especially because you're likely adding a JavaScript framework on top of that. So, yeah, it does make it a lot more involved that way. Um, and I mean, it's a little bit. I find it a little bit slower, just because like we said, you have to recompile your components every time, which is, I mean, if you have a fast build process, it's not a huge deal, but I'm really picky about load times like that, so I find it a little annoying.
Yeah, actually it's what it's a little bit frustrated for me is the fact that I have to include at the top the classes which I want.
Yeah, I hate that.
But I guess this is more like a implementation detail, because we could do it in a way that we could have, for example, like a style object, and you just type style dots and whatever you want everywhere.
Yeah,
But yeah,
there's definitely ways around it. I mean, do you know Brent Jackson? He's the dude who did base CSS a couple years ago, and he's done like
oh, I
a
remember.
hundred.
Yeah.
He's done like 100 million amazing React and like web design projects since then. He has this new project he made called Axis. I think it's pronounced Axis. It's AXS, and it's basically this CSS in JavaScript sort of skeleton framework for creating UI components. And he's done lots of neat things where, like, every component that this library exposes has built-in styling properties. So it has props for margin, for padding, for font size, for color. And so a lot of those really common things that you're always importing to use when you're doing CSS and JavaScript are now just component properties, which I find really, really cool. It takes out so much of that sort of annoying grunt work of just sort of getting all your objects imported in the right place. So there's definitely ways around it, which are becoming more and more interesting.
Actually, now when you're saying this, I remember Friday I was doing some work with media queries, and we do define some things which are associated with media queries as a props of the components. So this approach, like, I kind of feel it's better. So
Yeah. I think especially for those really common things like your layout properties like margin and padding and font size and all of that, if you have this sort of, high order component or something that, or, if you're injecting those props into all of your UI components, it just makes it so much nicer to work with. And then you're only having to, import styles that are much more, I guess, specific to the component you're using, which is kind of nice.
We might try this, by the way. I know.
It's yeah.
I mean, it looks like we'll eliminate even some composition that we're doing, like defining this object and we pass it to Glamor's CSS function, and then you get this and attach it to the class name. And
yeah. Well, what he does is there's also for every component there's also a CSS prop built in, and you just pass it an object of styles arbitrarily. And so you kind of, the workflow that I've been using with it is you kind of deal with all of your common styles as props on the component, and then everything else specific to the style is just an object on that component, which makes a fair bit of sense to me. I guess you could argue that there's some drawbacks because that sort of imposes more, well, it doesn't impose it. It suggests a more imperative way of styling, and maybe that breaks a bit from the design system context or whatever. But I mean, there's ways that you could build a design system into that as well, for sure. But yeah, it's a really neat way of thinking about how to build or how to style your components, for sure.
Yeah.
At the same time, I mean, you could just write a CSS file.
Which which leads to one of my next questions about how you feel about all these JavaScript building tools and all these libraries and gigantic node modules folders with lots of stuff inside, and I guess that you're not happy with all this stuff, right? Because it's kind of like, I can't even find a word about it, but it's having a build process of like many steps. Like,
I mean, yeah, it's sort of, I think at this point that sort of, having a compile step built into your workflow is sort of a necessary thing, right? Like the more customers and, companies want actual web apps and not just web pages, I mean, the more you have to deal with dynamic, actual functionality, and the more, that requires an actual, programming workflow rather than just doing HTML and markup, right? Or HTML and CSS. So, I mean, it's kind of par for the course at this point. As far as libraries and, all of that go, I mean, I really like React. Like ever since we've been working with it, I've really enjoyed working with it, even if sometimes I don't understand what the hell is going on. But that's a symptom of me not being a very super experienced JavaScript developer. But at the same time, learning how to work with it, and especially having the benefit of, working with such an awesome, experienced front-end team. I mean, I've felt so much more able to actually implement my work in a meaningful way. And I think the upside of React, as far as I've experienced it, is as opposed to something like, I have really minimal experience with Angular, but the one time I tried it, it had really, really sort of implementation specific details that you had to work with to really get it working. Whereas with React, a lot of the time it's just straight up JavaScript. And for someone who's learning front-end development, I mean, obviously JavaScript is the language to learn as far as behavior goes. Being able to leverage that while I'm building my UI components was really, really nice. And I haven't worked with really any other libraries in a meaningful way, but I really love how it sort of it gives you the tools you need to build sensible UI components, and then it kind of just gets out of the way and lets you write that behavior in JavaScript for the most part. And obviously you can plug in other things that add more layers and complexity to it, but as a basic concept, I find that really nice.
And the funny thing is that React is actually the JSX syntax, which I think brings all this stuff that you are talking about. Is actually just syntax sugar, right?
Yeah.
Because there's nothing like this in JavaScript. This is just like a text which you pass it to a transpiler and you get it like in a real working JavaScript.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think that this was the really smart idea by Facebook, actually.
Definitely, yeah. I mean, even before I became, officially a front-end developer, working with JSX-based components, I mean, obviously made so much sense from working with whatever handlebars templates or something like that. I mean, it's so similar to the HTML that pretty much every front-end developer knows. That part of the learning curve is really easy to get to grips with, which is a pretty big benefit. But certainly, I mean, if you think more globally, I mean, lots of people talk about JavaScript fatigue or programming fatigue or whatever, and I can certainly identify with that. I mean, if I had to go work on an Angular project or some other, cool library of the day project, I mean, I'd probably find it pretty hard to get up to speed with it.
Yeah, talk to me. If I had to switch to something else right now, I'll need probably half a year to just like get to the same level.
Yeah,
it's really I used to be up to date with all the stuff which are happening like in the JavaScript world, but last year I just lost track of so many stuff.
Oh man, it's impossible to keep up.
Yeah,
I mean, and I think it's probably silly for any of us to even try, right? Like, probably spend time focusing on what you actually need for the work that you're doing, and then the rest is like, I don't know, man. I've got lots of other stuff I need to do aside from writing code. I just don't have time to learn every new library that comes out. And I mean, I don't think that's an expectation that anyone should really hold.
Yeah, that's right. We're really close to the end, but just as a last topic, let's talk a little bit about photography.
Oh, sure.
I know that you are really into... I wouldn't say that this is a hobby, because for me this was a hobby. Years ago, I was spending some money on lenses and stuff. So, you're printing stuff now or something?
Yeah, I mean, I've been doing photography for pretty much as long as I've been doing design. So it's been another sort of lifelong pursuit of mine. And yeah, I guess recently, having gone into freelancing work, my goal has been to actually open up more time for photography during the week. So the thinking for me right now is I'm kind of at a point where I'd like to try my hand at taking it to a more serious level. I mean, it's always been something that I've been very serious about, but I'd like to try my hand at actually selling my work and seeing if I can go somewhere with it. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. Sorry, just to make a side note that Cole actually he has a book. So we'll publish a link at the end of the podcast.
Oh no!
Just buy the book. We have to support each other. We have to support each other, right?
That's very sweet of you. Thank you. It's funny because this last podcast I was speaking to my buddy John about, and it was all about photography, and he was like, "Oh yeah, so tell people where they can buy the book." And I was like, "Don't buy the book. It's dumb. It's so bad now."
Why?
But it's one of those things where I don't know. I find often as soon as I put new work out into the world, within about a month, I'm like, "No, I'm over it. I don't like it anymore." But yeah, no, you can people can go buy my book. That's cool. Help me pay the rent bills now that I'm freelancing.
So I don't think that with the photography for me is kind of really close to like selling designs, for example. So this can get older or something. While my books, actually, I have 2 books, but don't buy them because really don't, because they are like for things which change so it's just like another language now. So definitely it doesn't make sense to buy any of my stuff. While with photography is quite different because you could still enjoy.
Oh, sure. Yeah. I mean, I don't think, I mean, on a general sense that, in this case, that book has become worse or less relevant necessarily. It's just, for me personally, I'm kind of, onto exploring new things. And so, yeah, I'm kind of bored with it now. But I mean, on the flip side, I've had lots of really nice feedback about it. And it was a good, learning experience because it was the first time that it was the first time in ages that I sent anything to print with a proper like printing house. And it was cool to see that work transformed into a book that I can actually hold in my hands, which was pretty cool. But yeah, no, I mean, I change. I guess I learned so much from the work that I do that, the work that I've done in the past gets old so quickly for me.
I think that's a good thing, by the way. I mean, it's...
Yeah, I mean, if I still looked at this book and I was like, this is the best work I've ever done, like, man, something would be seriously wrong, for sure. But I mean, I think it was a good stepping stone. I mean, now, you sort of alluded to some of the printing work that I'm doing now. So now I'm sort of working on making my own prints of this newer work that I've been working on, and that feels really good. So it's all sort of, stepping stones, I guess.
So, you're printing by yourself?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And what are you doing with the result at the end? Like,
right now they're sitting in a box, but the longer term goal is to have them for sale on my website and eventually get into some of.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah, there'll be things that there'll be a series of limited edition prints that you can buy through my website or through other sort of like art purchasing channels. And eventually I'd like to, before we move out of London, I'd like to get into a couple of the art fairs that happen here because it's a great place to be potentially seen by gallery owners and publishers and that sort of thing. And that would be really nice. So yeah, sort of slowly working towards that.
Okay, so the only one thing which I could do is to say good luck. And I'll definitely add a link in the podcast. And so your book and that framework, CSS framework, this would be a nice set of links, I guess.
Yeah, I think there's still the CSS articles I've written are still on Medium. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I can post you some links to those so people can read them if they're interested.
Okay, awesome. So let me say bye to everyone, and I hope this will not be the last English episode, but we'll see what's the result.
Yeah, no, man, this was really good. You should definitely keep it up. Don't hesitate to keep doing more, I think.
Yeah, well, my worries were mainly around my level of English.
Nah, you have nothing to worry about.
Okay.
I'm more worried about my levels of proficiency with development being a concern for your listeners.
No. It was really interesting. I think the people will like it.
Cool, man. Well, this was lots of fun. Thanks for the chat.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.